Macron, his country is going through a lot right now. Protesters in France, we've been covering this. They're still protesting. They're still mad at Macron over him increasing the retirement age from 62 to 64. But now Macron has made a statement. And look, I am all for people standing up on their own and saying, you know what, we're going to make our own damn decisions. I'm all for that. But it's kind of funny it's coming from him because he doesn't even have control of his own country right now. He is not even trying to please his own citizens. And he's trying to tell the entire continent of Europe what they should and should not do. Now, this is in reference to China and Taiwan, this conflict. Now, Macron recently met with Xi Jinping, and they had a conversation in there in reference to Russia and Ukraine. And he also said at that discussion that he could not fully support or fully break away from China, that he will still support China in some way, shape, or form, because he said we just cannot afford to do that, you know, as a country. He realizes who butters the bread. But now Macron is saying some things, and I want you to hear what he had to say about what Europe should do in reference to this conflict between China and Taiwan. Listen to this. He's given an entire continent advice and he can't control his own country. This is funny.
The French president's 3-day visit to Beijing could have ended in two ways. One, where Europe brings China on board the diplomatic table. Or two, China brings Europe to its side to see how different the same table looks. We can conclude now that the trip has done a bit of both. On his way back from Beijing, Emmanuel Macron was interviewed by Politico, and he made this statement. I'm quoting here, "Europe must reduce its dependency on the United States. The great risk Europe faces is that it gets caught up in crises that are not ours."
Now, I don't have any problem with that statement. Here's the thing, okay? I don't have a problem with this. Europe must reduce its dependency on the United States. I agree. The great risk Europe faces is that it gets caught up in crises that are not ours. I agree. But the problem is it's coming from him. Like that's the Sacre Bleu. That's the problem. It's coming from him. So I totally get where he's coming from with that. And then this brings up the question in reference to allyship, because if countries like France are an ally of the United States, and most of the European countries are, I asked this question a couple weeks ago. When is it okay as an ally to stand up and say, no, I do not back you on this particular situation? When is that okay? Apparently, in reference to the situation with China and Taiwan, he don't really want to follow the U.S. lead. And he apparently also doesn't want to follow China's lead. He really wants Europe to stand up on their own and make their own decisions when it comes to these conflicts. And I totally understand that. I get that. Probably should have came from someone else, though. I'm just saying. Let's go on.
Up in crises that are not ours. And this prevents it from building its strategic autonomy. Now, coming from a key European country like France, this has raised many eyebrows. While Macron was talking in reference to Taiwan, the comments are being seen in a broader light as by experts. Macron had a similar stance on the defense industry as well, nuclear and renewable energy as well, and even dependence on the US dollar. The Western world is mostly seen as United States and Europe.
That piece right there, even when it comes to the US dollar. So now we already know that BRICS, well, most of them in BRICS have decided like, we're just not going to go with US currency anymore. We're going to start like our own currency, right? This was kind of led by China. So Brazil has signed on for this. I believe India is a part of this as well. And now you have Macron from France saying like, yeah, even when it comes to the US dollar, I don't think we should really get with that anyway. What is happening, people? Because it seems like to me, he seems to be very brave and strong when it comes to standing up to other countries. But when it comes to just simply listening to and hearing the people in his own country, the people protesting, the millions of people protesting in France right now, they've been doing so for the past 2 weeks, he's absent. He's absent. He went to China and people were burning things down, including his favorite restaurant and including BlackRock. He doesn't even want to talk to his own people. He doesn't want to talk to his own citizens. That's the thing. Like, I feel like this is more believable to me if it came from someone else. Like, that's the thing.
While that is wrong from geography's point of view, it has made sense in politics, but maybe not anymore. The White House is vehemently pushing for policies to counter China. It is already facing a deterrence. It's already facing a difference of opinion from South Asia and Africa, where most of the countries are not giving in to Washington's diplomacy bullying, to say the least. They are choosing their interests over a crisis that has nothing to do with them.
And they see it as a form of bullying. And again, guys, you can answer this question for me in the chat. If you are an ally to another country, is there ever a point in time when you feel it is okay to say, we are not going to back you on this particular event or situation? Yes or no? Yes or no? Because I think this is a lesson for the U.S. government. You know, the U.S. government wants to police the world. They want to have their hand in every country. They want to have their hand. They want to steal resources in countries as well. Those countries become impoverished. The people struggle there because of it. But now we have reached a point, at least in my lifetime, where other countries, even those that were allies of the United States, are starting to push back and are starting to stand up and say, you know what? How about you leave us out of this one, right? We don't really want to get into this conflict with China and Taiwan. We don't really want anything to do with that. That's your jam. We're going to do something different. Things are changing, people. Things are changing. And this is just what I remember in my lifetime. I don't remember seeing this before. I don't remember seeing this before. Let's go on.
And France is eyeing this club. China had to make sure that Europe does not get sucked into playing America's game. These statements are testament to that. Europe is ready to accept a world in which China becomes a regional. If we quickly zoom out on the world map, we see a similar pattern emerging in West Asia as well. A
He said we cannot continue to play the U.S. game.
region that was long seen as Washington's playground. But U.S. influence has come under fire, at least in this region. Joe Biden might say that the U.S. is not going anywhere. However, the countries are realizing that they don't need the U.S. to shape West Asia anymore, be that.
Did you hear that? These countries are realizing they don't need the U.S. to shape West Asia anymore. They don't need us anymore.
China getting Iran and Saudi Arabia to the talking table, or Saudi and Oman sitting down with Houthi officials. The world order is changing. And for the first time, U.S. is not at the center of it.
There you go. Times have changed. Times are changing. You know, some of the countries got behind the U.S. in reference to this conflict with Russia and Ukraine, right? But countries in Africa decided to remain neutral. What's interesting about that, I mentioned this because it was actually Macron who tried to pressure political leaders in Africa to choose a side in reference to Russia and Ukraine. That came from Macron. And now that same guy is telling people, yeah, we don't need to play the US game. We need to make decisions for ourselves. But you wanted to tell leaders in Africa to play your game. This is the thing that cracks me up. I don't know. I don't know what this is about. But Politico goes further into this as well. It says Europe must resist pressure to become America's followers, says Macron. Look at the look on his face. Boy, I tell you. Let me just read a little bit of this here. Europe must reduce its dependency on the U.S. and avoid getting dragged into confrontation between China and the U.S. over Taiwan. Again, that comes from Macron. That was when he got back from his 3-day visit in China, right? Speaking with Politico and two French journalists after spending around 6 hours with Chinese President Xi Jinping during his trip, Macron emphasized his pet theory of strategic autonomy for Europe, presumably led by France, to become a third superpower. Now, I'm going to tell you why that actually is probably not going to work. It goes back to another agreement that happened in the 1990s. I'm going to pull that up in just a second. But he wants France to even be the leader. He wants France to lead it. But you can't run your own country right now. You can't. Let's go on. He said the great risk Europe faces is that it gets caught up in crises that are not ours, which prevents it from building its strategic autonomy. It goes on here. The paradox would be that, overcome with panic, we believe we are just America's followers. The question Europeans need to answer: is it in our interest to accelerate a crisis on Taiwan? No. The worst thing would be to think that we Europeans must become followers on this topic and take our cue from the U.S. agenda and a Chinese overreaction. He's criticizing both here. And then I want to end with this piece here. Just hours after his flight, headed back to Paris, China launched large military exercises around the self-ruled island of Taiwan, which China claims as its territory, but the U.S. has promised to arm and defend. And I just want to say something again here. We need to remember that Taiwan is a part of China. Okay. Notice how Politico worded that. China claims as its territory. Taiwan is a part of China. It is not a separate thing. So let's go back in. Those exercises were a response to a Taiwanese president Wynn's 10-day diplomatic tour of Central American countries that included a meeting with Republican U.S. House Senator Kevin McCarthy while she transited in California. People familiar with Macron's thinking said he was happy Beijing had at least waited until he was out of the Chinese airspace before launching the simulated Taiwan encirclement exercise. Beijing has repeatedly threatened to invade in recent years and has a policy of isolating the democratic island by forcing other countries to recognize it as part of one China. Now, forcing them to recognize it is a part of China. You got to check the wording with Politico sometimes. Now, this idea that Macron has about Europe becoming a third superpower, releasing the hold that the U.S. government has on it, that actually may not be plausible. And it goes all the way back to something called the Wolfowitz doctrine. Now, I want to explain this really quickly. The Wolfowitz doctrine, and this is named after Paul Wolfowitz. He was the sponsor of the doctrine. It is an unofficial name given to the initial version of the Defense Planning Guide for the 1994 to 1999 fiscal years, dated February 18th, 1992, published under Secretary of Defense for Policy Paul Wolfowitz and his deputy Scooter Libby. It was not intended for public release. It was leaked to the New York Times on March 7th, 1992. I'm going to show you that actual 1992 article, by the way. It sparked a public controversy about the U.S. foreign and defense policy. The document was widely criticized as imperialist, as the document outlined a policy of unilateralism and preemptive military action to suppress potential threats from other nations and prevent dictatorships from rising to superpower status. That piece is important. This goes all the way back to the 90s. Now, here's that article. New York Times, March 8th, 1992. Again, this was not supposed to be public information, but it got out there. U.S. strategy plan calls for ensuring no rivals develop. That includes China, that includes Russia, and that would include Europe too, if Macron wants Europe to be a third superpower. Let's go on. There's a piece from here that I want to read as well. Hopefully that's large enough. In a broad new policy statement that is in its final drafting stage, the Defense Department asserts that America's political and military mission in the post-Cold War era will be to ensure that no rival superpower is allowed to emerge in Western Europe, Asia, or the territory of the former Soviet Union. Let me highlight this. Not one. So just keep that in mind. This is why I continue to bring up the banks. This is why I keep telling you China has most of the banks in the top 10 in the world. This is what this is really about. This is not to say China is innocent. This is not to say Russia is innocent. Every country has their faults. But this is to point out a fact that there is an economic price here. And anytime another country starts to become a serious challenger to the United States economically or militarily or both, that is a problem. And that dates back to this particular document. It was a 46-page document. It was circulating at the highest levels of the Pentagon for weeks, in which Defense Secretary Dick Cheney, oh, remember that guy, expects to release later this month, states that part of the American mission will be convincing potential competitors that they need not aspire to a greater role or pursue a more aggressive posture to protect their legitimate interest. Highlight this. Convincing potential competitors that they need not aspire to a greater role, that they need to stay where they are. They're allowed to go through a period of decline, but they're not allowed to become successful to the point that they are a serious competitor economically or militarily to the United States. This is a problem. So you see what happens, guys? You see what happens? When you have those countries that are on the brink of that, China is on the brink of that. Russia is on the brink of that. You don't think the US government is going to try to find a way to suppress that? Dr. Nick, stay in your lane is basically the US foreign policy. There you go. This wasn't that long ago. 1992. And the only reason people found out about it is because it was leaked to the New York Times. Other than that, we still may never know about this. The Oracle says full spectrum dominance. Yep. There you go. So I agree with what Macron's saying is that, you know, maybe they should start making their own decisions and not just go along with the US every time. And especially with this situation with China and Taiwan, not go along with China either, that they should be able to be independent enough to have their own voice and their own say. I get all of that. But according to the Wolfowitz doctrine, the US government isn't going to make that possible.